When you think of street photography, chances are some of the names that come to mind include Cartier-Bresson, Saul Leiter, Helen Levitt, or Gary Winogrand. And you'd be right with any of those choices. They're all icons who have made pictures that have both captured and in some cases defined the eras in which they were taken. I'd like to introduce you to a street photographer you may never have heard of. I certainly hadn't until her publicist reached out to me. And I'm so glad that she did because I've enjoyed doing all of the reading, watching, and listening to prepare for this video. Plus, the monographs that Radius Books sent over are just gorgeous. But before we dive into the work, I'd like to talk a little about what we mean by street photography. According to Wikipedia, street photography is, quote, photography conducted for art or inquiry that features unmediated chance encounters and random incidents within public places, end quote. Digital Photography School says that street photography is about, quote, candidly photographing life and human nature, end quote. And according to Visco, street photography is, quote, an act of observing the world as it presents itself, end quote. I like each of these, but the two things that stand out for me are chance and random from Wikipedia. Why are those two things important? Well, I think it's because street photography is rooted in observation, witnessing the world around you, not in staging or construction. For example, many of you know that my favorite photographer is Gregory Crewdson. If you were unfamiliar with Gregory's work and saw this photo from his series Beneath the Roses, you might assume that he just happened upon this scene. After all, it's not that different than this photo by Joel Meyerowitz from his series Cape Light. However, in the case of Crewdson, while the location is real, the yellow traffic lights, the type and placement of the car and who's inside it, whether the shop lights are on or off, what we see on the marquee, the placement and costuming of the woman in the restaurant, even how much snow is on the ground. Literally, every detail is a decision made by Crewdson in order to create the image he sees in his mind. By contrast, the scene in the Meyerowitz picture was observed and captured as it was, without any intervention on the part of the photographer. So while both shots depict a seemingly random scene, in reality, they couldn't be more different. What about people? There's a running debate among some street photographers as to whether or not people need to be present in the image in order for it to qualify, quote unquote, as street photography. Now, my friend Sean Tucker did a whole video about this, and according to him, street photography is any candid image taken on the street, which I tend to agree with.
I think if you ask a lot of photographers, they'd argue yes, because street photography traditionally, I think, has had quite a narrow definition. In the minds of many, it's got to show people doing recognizable things in public. It's straight reportage. But I have a much wider definition for street photography for myself, and I consider it to be any candid image taken on the street. And yes, that of course includes that traditional style of street photography where we're focusing on people and what they're doing. But it can also include textures or colors or graphics or light and shadow or empty spaces or the little tiny details that are ignored by passers-by. And that's what I want to focus on in this video, those everyday mundane objects or artifacts which can take on special significance if we capture them in the right light and the right way.
All right, now that we're more or less on the same page as to what street photography is and isn't, let me introduce you to some work that blurs the lines of street photography, much in the same way that Valda Bailey, whose work I absolutely love, blurs the lines of landscape and nature photography. I think work like this can be challenging for some people, especially if you prefer cleaner images that are a bit more obvious in terms of genre. And if that's your thing, there's nothing wrong with that. Sandra Cattaneo Adorno first picked up a camera in 2013 at the age of 60, after her daughter took her to a photography workshop with Alex and Rebecca Webb. Since then, her work has been featured in dozens of exhibitions, and she's won multiple awards, including the Gold Award at the 2025 Tokyo Foto Awards for her brilliant book 10 Years, which is exactly where I'd like to start. As I said, Radius was kind enough to send me 3 of Sandra Adorno's monographs, which are all stunning. But I think the images and some of the creative choices made in the production of 10 Years makes it a fantastic introduction to Sandra's work. Inside the blind embossed cover, which echoes one of the images inside, you'll find a double-sided accordion fold of nearly 100 images printed in metallic gold ink on matte black paper, which I think was a terrific creative choice. With the reduced dynamic range, the strength of the composition really takes center stage because there's nowhere to hide in terms of color or tone. Some of the pictures are even inverted to take better advantage of the gold on black printing. You see details that you don't see in the positive, Sandra said in an interview. The only other book that I own that has a similar feel to it because of the printing is Daido Tokyo by Daido Moriyama, who is another favorite photographer of mine. But now that I'm looking at them side by side, they aren't quite as similar as I had originally thought, because the silver really ends up making the work look closer to a black and white photo. Also, Moriyama's work is much more literal, whereas Sandra's work, especially with the gold, feels much more dreamlike. As much as I would love to keep attempting to wax poetic about the book, I think the words of photographer and writer Colin Pantel do a much better job than I could. 10 Years is a book of fishermen, beaches, construction, and gold-glimmering water. It's an elemental book where earth, wind, fire, and water all play out in a sea of golds and blacks. A book object in itself where the printing, the binding, and the sequence all combine to glorious effect. I don't think I could have said it any better. I knew I was going to love the work in Sandra's 2022 book Scarti di Tempo from the moment I saw how the printed acetate jacket set the stage for the double exposures inside. This book feels like her most experimental body of work. The story goes that when Sandra was in production for her second book, Aguas de Oro, which I'll show you in a minute, she noticed how the bright CMYK colors of the printing plates affected her images, which gave her the idea to combine seemingly unrelated photos from her archive into entirely new compositions. The resulting body of work is much more abstract than her other work, and is interesting in that it plays not just with composition, but also with time. In fact, the title, Scarti di Tempo, translates to scraps of time. And just as with 10 Years, I love how this book is printed. Rather than single pages, the book is printed using a French fold, which I had never heard of until I called Radius to ask them about it. It's similar to the accordion method used in 10 Years, except that the spine is bound rather than loose. As you flip through the book, images not only cross gutters, but also occasionally wrap around pages, which I think acts as a subtle visual reinforcement of moving through time. The book is dotted with translucent single pages that feature quotes by Ukrainian-born Brazilian novelist Clarice Lispector, taken from her novel Agua Viva and selected by Rebecca Webb, who also provides the afterword. I love that these pages don't extend to the edge, but instead give the viewer a hint of what's to come. In addition to a brief foreword by Magnum photographer Georgy Pinkasov, there's a QR code that links to a piece of music composed by Sandra's husband Marcello, though unfortunately at the time of this recording, the link seems to be down. Gregory Crewdson did something similar for his 2020 body of work, An Eclipse of Moths, with Wilco frontman Jeff Tweedy providing the music. In Aguas de Oro from 2020, I think we get a glimpse of where Sandra would ultimately go with 10 Years. In fact, the end papers and the first and last few pages are printed in a similar gold on black style. Working once again with Radius creative director David Chicky, who designed her first book, The Other Half of the Sky, the superb design and production quality elevate the end product beyond just another photo book. The dramatic images, many of which are in near silhouette, aren't quite full color, nor are they entirely black and white. The warm gold and cool blue tinting on the subtle sheen of metallic paper evokes the feeling of sunlight against the sea. In fact, Kenneth Dickerman of the Washington Post calls the book, quote, a beautifully realized meditation on the vibrant beach culture of Rio de Janeiro, end quote. One of the most striking aspects of this body of work is the palpable sense of joy that permeates it. While it's evident in the subjects she photographs, it's not just limited to the subject matter. It's also core to her process of creating images. Photography, for me, is pure joy, she explains. It's a way of interacting with people and having fun. I feel like a child playing. I have thoroughly enjoyed doing the research for this video. I was surprised to see how much of Sandra's creative journey resonates with my own. Starting photography later in life meant that she could pursue it simply for the love of it, or the joy, as she says, rather than as a business that comes with its own set of expectations and obligations. Taking pictures seems to be a reflection of her life experiences, not a definition of who she is. I love that her continued collaboration with the team at Radius has yielded such beautiful results. I'm sure that at least some of the choices made by the design team, like the acetate jacket and French fold, often go unnoticed by most people. However, for those of us who find inspiration and fuel in these kinds of details, they can hold as much significance as the content itself, sometimes even more. And whether or not you explicitly notice them while flipping through one of their books, the fact that these kinds of details have been so carefully considered and included enhances the overall viewing experience. As I told you at the beginning, Sandra didn't start taking pictures until she was 60. Why is this important, or how is it relevant? Well, if you're in your 20s or 30s, it might not be. But next month, I turn 58, and I can tell you that I have spent much of the last decade of my life, maybe even longer, thinking that I have more or less missed my window to do anything that's meaningful or even good, whatever that means. I think Sandra is a brilliant example and a wonderful validation that it's never too late to begin or to do great work. You just have to decide to get out of your own way and do the work, whatever that work is to you. Start painting, write a book, make a movie, or pick up a camera. As the world gets more and more polarized and uncertain, I think the need for art and culture and those who create it becomes increasingly vital. You may not change the whole world, but you might make yours a little better. Click the links to learn more about Sandra and all of the photographers I mentioned. Hey, before I let you go, I'm assuming that since you watched this video, you're either a photographer or you're at least interested in photography, right? If so, you might like my book, Photography by the Letter. With a visual style inspired by vintage camera manuals, it's a comprehensive field guide for photographers and photo enthusiasts alike that features more than 250 photographic terms, from aperture to zebra stripes, defined and explained through more than 100 unique photos and dozens of original diagrams. There are also tips, exercises, Q&As, inspirational photography-related quotes, and interviews with terrific photographers like Brooke Shaden, David Duchemin, John Keatley, and a bunch of others who are all at the top of their respective genres. You can get it in print on Amazon or as a downloadable PDF that will work on computers, tablets, and phones. Find out more on my website at jeffreysidoris.com. Thanks for watching.